Thank you everyone for joining us today for the pre-recording of Richard Rothstein's lecture. I am Dennis Chiesa, Assistant Professor of Architecture, and my partner and collaborator in this is Dr. Juwan Im, a Professor of Landscape Architecture. We have been working, making our best efforts to invite Richard to participate in the CAPPA Symposium, and it is our great honor to finally have him here. Today's lecture will be recorded and presented at the CAPPA Open City Symposium on April 9th. After the lecture, Richard will take questions from the audience. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He wrote The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, and many other books in the areas of education, race, and ethnicity in the United States. As the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex continues to grow, many of our neighborhoods continue to face challenges resulting from segregation. Today, many historically underinvested communities fear the effects of gentrification and displacement. Having Richard at CAPPA is a great opportunity for us to engage in candid dialogue as we develop strategies to assist communities in need. Please help me welcome Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiesa, and thank you for asking me to share this history of segregation with you. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. We began by challenging segregation in law schools. Civil rights lawyers then went on to use those precedents to challenge segregation in colleges and universities, and then in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Many were seriously injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, and with a lot of cause of good trouble, as the late John Lewis referred to it, we succeeded in abolishing segregation in public accommodations and transportation, in employment. But yet, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our status as a constitutional democracy, how could we leave untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly, I guess it's because it's hard to desegregate neighborhoods. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation of restaurants or buses, the next day you can go to any restaurant or sit anywhere you want on a bus. So if we pass a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, is adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not attempting to redress this biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is racially segregated. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of transportation or public accommodations or employment in many cases, that was required by government. If the federal government was requiring it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation. And if you have a Fifth Amendment violation, it's a civil rights violation. We're obligated to do something to fix it. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation, also a civil rights violation, something we're obligated to fix. But Residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy of any kind. It just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. It happened, maybe because bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because banks and realtors and developers and insurance companies were racially discriminatory. Or maybe it happened, people like to live with each other of the same race and we self-segregate. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of income differences. African Americans, on average, not all, but on average, have lower incomes than average white incomes. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity communities. All of these individual, bigoted, but non-public causes is what caused racial segregation of neighborhoods. And we tell us what happened naturally, what happened by accident, can only unhappen naturally and unhappen by accident. Well, most of us I'm sure think it's too bad that we're so segregated, but because we don't regard it as a constitutional violation, not something done by government, we feel no obligation as American citizens to do something about it. Well, some of you may know I spent a lot of years writing about education policy. I only came to this topic, residential segregation, perhaps 10 years ago, a bit more. And as an education policy writer in the 1990s and 2000s, I came to understand that the education policy that we were following as a nation, in fact, led by Texas, made no sense. The idea was that the reason that African American children had lower average scores than white children, we called it an achievement gap. We said that the reason that this achievement gap existed was because teachers had low expectations of Black children, and to some extent of Hispanic and low-income children generally. They didn't try very hard to teach them. And we told ourselves if we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I regarded this as a ludicrous theory, despite the fact that it came out of your great state. We passed the national law incorporating this theory. It was called the No Child Left Behind law that was supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The law said that we were going to test children every year. We were going to hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores. And the law predicted that in 7 years, the achievement gap would disappear if only we held schools accountable for children's test scores, forced teachers to try harder. As I said, I thought it was ludicrous. The law had virtually no effect. We still have an achievement gap today, much more than 7 years after the law was passed. And I wrote column after column trying to explain why I thought this theory made no sense. It's true that some teachers are bigoted, some teachers don't try very hard, but that's not the main reason we have an achievement gap. The main reason we have an achievement gap is because of the social and economic conditions that so many African American and other low-income children, Hispanic, come to school with that interferes with their ability to learn. And I wrote column after column about this. I remember writing one about asthma. As you may know, African American children in low-income neighborhoods and urban areas of this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. And the reason they have asthma at such a high rate is because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more deteriorated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not. It's not true in every case, but more likely to be up at night wheezing, sleepless, coming to school drowsy the next day. And I wrote in this column, if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have somewhat lower achievement simply from being sleepier in school. It doesn't make a big difference, but then you begin to think of all of the other conditions that have a similar impact on achievement, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. When you begin to add all of these conditions up, they pretty much explain the achievement gap. There's a little bit left for low teacher expectations, but not much. And then as I was thinking about this and writing about it as an education policy analyst, I began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens when you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions? How can you ever expect such a school to have the same average achievement for children as a school where children come healthy, well rested, well nourished, in economically secure homes? Obviously, you can't have that expectation, or I guess you can have that expectation, it won't be fulfilled. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these kinds of social and economic disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And as you may know, schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in this country in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which those schools are located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem, something that education policymakers needed to be concerned about. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated two school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. Both of them had a very trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend. But if that choice was going to further exacerbate segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent whose child wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, both the black and the white child applied for the last remaining place. The black child would be given some preference. Very trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and you have to choose between two different race children. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision, the controlling opinion, was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that it's true. He said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said that they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. But then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in those two cities were segregated de facto, he called it, because of private bigotry and the actions of private businesses and people's self-choice and income differences. And he said, we have de facto segregation, something that government didn't create. Government is prohibited under the Constitution from taking explicit action to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading some years before about something that happened in one of those cities, Louisville, Kentucky. In a suburb of Louisville called Shively, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in this all-white suburb of Louisville. He had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to the African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry mob of white residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop any of this activity. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. Maybe there's something about the history of Louisville, Kentucky that the Chief Justice John Roberts doesn't know or doesn't want to know. And I began to look into it further, and I found, and I am not exaggerating now, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of mob violence, frequently police protected, sometimes police organized and led mob violence in the 20th century to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, every one, was a civil rights violation. The police are state actors violating the 14th Amendment when they were protecting, leading, or organizing these mobs. And because it's a civil rights violation, we as American citizens have an obligation to fix it, to remedy it. We've never accepted that obligation. And I began to look into it further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the racial boundaries that we know so well everywhere in this country, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit policies, that ensured that we would have segregation everywhere in this country, that blacks and whites could not live near one another anywhere. Well, let me spend a few minutes today describing one, perhaps two, if I have time, of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed to ensure we have racial segregation. In the post-World War II period, the federal government embarked on a program to suburbanize the entire white working class and lower middle class population into single-family homes in suburbs that now exist everywhere in this country. We were not a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent people. Working class, middle class families weren't living in suburbs. They weren't living in suburbs because we were a manufacturing economy. None of this internet stuff in those days. We were making things, and factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals so they can get their parts and ship their final products. So if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they were all living in broadly the same neighborhoods. Well, we'd be stunned if we were transported back to that time, the early mid-20th century, to see the extent of residential integration that existed in many, many parts of this country, even in the South. The South had segregated water fountains and lunch counters in schools, but integrated neighborhoods frequently for the reason I just mentioned. Workers had to live close enough to walk to work. They didn't have automobiles at that time. Well, the federal government began a program to suburbanize the entire white population that was living in cities at that time. Suburbs were created everywhere in the country, around every city, around Dallas, around Chicago, around Detroit, around New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Perhaps the best known one, especially to those of you who are urban planning or architecture students, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place, an enormous project. No bank would lend the money to William Levitt, the developer, for such a crazy idea. They didn't think anybody would want to live in the suburbs, despite the fact that there were millions of returning war veterans coming home, needing housing. But we weren't a suburban country. It wasn't thought of as being a reasonable place to build housing out there in the suburbs. The only way that Levitt and any of these other builders in your communities or anywhere in the country could build these kinds of subdivisions was by going to the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design he would use, the materials, construction materials that would be employed, the layout of the streets, and a federally required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federally required commitment that Levitt had to make. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats to demand this. This was a written policy of the federal government. The federal government distributed something it called an underwriting manual to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend the applications of developers to build homes or suburban homes. The underwriting manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development or a project that would include African Americans and an otherwise white project. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. The federal government created the white noose that exists around every metropolitan area in this country on a racially explicit basis. And this policy has enormous consequences and determines, to some extent, the racial segregation that we have today. It's not simply a historical curiosity. The homes in these suburbs in the mid-20th century sold at the time for about $8,000 a piece, in today's money about $100,000. inflation adjusted. As you know, those suburban homes no longer sell for $100,000 today. I don't know, maybe you can buy one in Dallas, in the Dallas suburbs for $100,000. I'm not sure, but I doubt it. In most places, they sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations equity as the homes appreciated in value. They gained that equity, that wealth, from the appreciation in the value of their homes. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, perhaps unemployment or maybe a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes on average, family incomes. That's a big disparity. There's a whole story behind that as well. I'm not going to describe it today. There's no time, but you'd think if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People could save the same amounts of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American family incomes on average are about 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that has never been remedied. That wealth gap, that enormous wealth gap, of course, reinforces and in some cases creates the segregation that we have today. African Americans are still unable to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods because they don't have the down payments. Leave aside the income gap, they don't have the down payments necessary to access homes, even if they could afford them on an ongoing basis. But the wealth gap also contributes to a large extent to that achievement gap in schools that I talked about before, by resulting in the concentration of the most disadvantaged children in single neighborhoods, where they overwhelm the ability of schools to deal with their social and economic challenges. The wealth gap contributes to health disparities between Blacks and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted neighborhoods without access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. It contributes to the mass incarceration and police abuse of African Americans that we spent so much time demonstrating about this past summer and spring in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I'm not suggesting that police would never abuse young African American men. Some would, of course, even in the absence of segregation. But when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or the transportation to get to those jobs, or schools that aren't overwhelmed by social and economic problems, when you concentrate those young men, it's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with them. Police are going to adopt the kinds of habits that colonial police forces adopted in the 20th century in colonial India or the Congo or any place else where police forces are charged with keeping a low-income, disadvantaged population under control. And the wealth gap contributes to something else with its contribution to segregation that I think is very, very dangerous, frightening indeed, and it's something we're all very much aware of in today's environment, and that is the very, very great political polarization that exists in this country today. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that President Biden called for and that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other's life experiences, to empathize with each other? It's pretty hard to imagine a common national identity in those circumstances. So that's the ongoing effect of the policies I just described. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that prohibited future discrimination in the sale of rental of housing. We included some enforcement mechanisms in 1988, pretty recently. But the Fair Housing Act can't redress the segregation that I just described. It's resulted, for example, to use the example I gave a few minutes ago, in Levittown, in about 2% of Levittown, 1 to 2% of Levittown now being African American. African Americans own a small number of homes in Levittown. They can afford to buy homes at $400,000, $500,000. But Levittown is located in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So the difference between that 2% that the Fair Housing Act is able to address and the 15% that was unconstitutionally created, the difference that was unconstitutionally created by federal government policy, is what requires a remedy that we have never adopted or examined. Let me quickly refer to one other policy that the federal government followed, and there are many, many others in my book, The Color of Law. I describe many policies of the federal, state, and local government besides state-sponsored segregation and state-sponsored violence, rather, and the suburbanization on a white basis. I'll mention one other, and that's public housing, something that we misunderstand today. We think it's a place for poor people, lots of single mothers with children, lots of, again, young men without access to good jobs. It's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country in the New Deal during the Depression, the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. Poor people weren't permitted into public housing. The only people permitted in public housing was working class families, middle class families who could afford the full cost of rent. It wasn't subsidized, but there was no housing available for them because there was so little construction going on in the Depression. The federal government built the first public housing in this country in the 1930s, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it. Frequently, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, with separate projects for African Americans and separate projects for whites. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today, but he says in high school his best friend was Polish, said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. Not surprising, it was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished some housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in Cleveland, reinforced it to help create the pattern that still exists there today. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to describe some self-satisfied, smug places that think they're maybe better than red states like yours. One of them you may have heard of is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white, half black. Public Works Administration and federal agencies demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other projects like that elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, created the pattern of segregation that we know in the Boston metropolitan area today. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war plants that hadn't existed during the Depression. Black and white workers both flocked to these centers of war production. And the federal government had to find housing for these workers when they overwhelmed the communities where the war plants were created, and everywhere that it found housing for workers. It created housing for workers. If it wanted the ships and the tanks and the airplanes to be produced, it had to do so. And everywhere it segregated it, creating separate projects for African American and white workers who were working in the same war plants, but having to live in separately created federal housing. This is how the West Coast came to be segregated. As you may know, if you know the history of the Great Migration out of the southern states into the rest of the country of African Americans from the former slave-holding states like Texas, you know that there were very few coming to California prior to World War II. The migration to the Midwest and the East took place initially around World War I, but to California and the West Coast, it took place in World War II. So in San Francisco, which was the center of shipbuilding, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't even been hinted at prior to World War II, because there were so few African Americans living there. And the same thing was done in Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles. That's how the West Coast came to be segregated. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There is no mystery about them. Think tanks, policy writers, housing experts, developers know exactly what we should do to redress segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to cause as much trouble, to be as aggressive and militant in its efforts to redress residential segregation as it was in the 1960s to redress segregation in public accommodations and transportation and the other public activities that we engaged in. And that civil rights movement will only arise if the nation becomes aware of its constitutional responsibility to redress segregation, because we demolished the myth of de facto segregation. I can mention a few policies to show you how obvious they are. I mentioned before the development of all white suburbs, places like Levittown, and I mentioned the 13% gap in African-American home ownership that exists in a place like Levittown because of the federal unconstitutional policies. Well, the federal government should adopt an affirmative action program in housing for a place like Levittown, where it buys up homes at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, whatever they are, and resells them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans to redress the narrow constitutional violation that was created. It's a narrowly targeted remedy for a specific constitutional violation in the context of the history that we now know. That would be a perfectly acceptable use of a race-conscious policy. We have many policies at the low end of the income scale that reinforce segregation today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the low-income house tax credit, low-income housing tax credit, which is the biggest federal program to subsidize the housing of low-income families, predominantly African American, and not predominantly, disproportionately African American and Hispanic. The low-income housing tax credit is a program of the Treasury Department. It distributes tax credits to states, which then distribute them to developers. Those of you in Dallas know this one very well. Absurdly, the federal Treasury Department regulations place a premium on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's the opposite of what we should be doing. It's not that we shouldn't be placing low-income housing tax credit units in those neighborhoods. We should do everything we can to improve the conditions in those neighborhoods by building better housing. But we should also be placing them in higher opportunity neighborhoods where the families who choose to live in them will have access to better jobs and transportation and cleaner air and schools that aren't overwhelmed with social and economic problems. And those are the kinds of places where more of them should be built. You all know that the Dallas project, the Inclusive Communities Project, won a Supreme Court decision in 2015, challenging the very fact that the state of Texas was concentrating its low-income housing tax credit units in low-income communities and reinforcing segregation. The Supreme Court found that this could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. It did specifically find that the Dallas policy was a violation, but as a result of that decision, Dallas and the state of Texas have done a somewhat better job in placing more low-income housing tax credit units in higher opportunity communities. Same thing is true of the Section 8 program, a subsidy not to developers, but to families that helps them to rent apartments at market rates. That program also reinforces segregation today. In most of the country, landlords are permitted, it's perfectly legal, to say we're not going to rent to you because you have a federal subsidy for your housing, to discriminate against voucher holders on that basis. Some communities have prohibited that kind of discrimination. That should be done everywhere. The whole structure of the Section 8 program should be revised. There are some places in an experimental program that the Obama administration began where the voucher amounts are adjusted so that they're higher in places where rents are higher and lower in places where rents are lower. This should be systematically done across the country as a way of redressing the segregation that we created. There are many, many other policies. Perhaps a big one is zoning laws that prohibit the construction of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes. They prevent the construction of townhouses or garden apartments or low-level apartments either that would fit in perfectly well with a residential neighborhood. Those zoning laws themselves, if abolished, would not accomplish racial desegregation, but it's a first step on the way of creating opportunity for low income and moderate income, particularly moderate income African Americans and Hispanic families to access higher opportunity communities. The policies to say are well known. What's needed is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable not to adopt policies such as that, both in local communities and nationwide. I am involved now with a group of national civil rights and fair housing leaders who are attempting to launch something they call a new movement to redress racial segregation. It will be launched, it was about to be launched about a year ago, and it was put on pause because you can't organize local committees in a time of social distancing. But we're about to relaunch it soon. And any of you who are interested in receiving an announcement of the launch of this new movement to redress racial segregation, I'll be sure, if you've registered for this session, to get you a link that you can use to receive the announcement of it. There are many policies that can be done at a local level to begin this process, even before we have majority support for substantial legislative changes. One of the things that the new movement to redress racial segregation has sponsored is a curriculum materials that can be used in local schools to teach this history of unconstitutional segregation accurately. In the course of writing my book, The Color of Law, I caused myself to examine all of the textbooks that are commonly used in American history courses in this country, in every high school in the country, to describe segregation. Every one of them lies about this, promotes the notion of de facto segregation, talks about the great work that the Federal Housing Administration did in creating suburbs, never mentioning it was for whites only. Talks about the great work that the New Deal did in creating housing for families who were homeless, never mentioning it was done on a segregated basis. Well, one thing the local committee to redress segregation could do to begin is mobilize support to get its school district to teach a more accurate history, not only of residential segregation, but of our legacies of slavery and Jim Crow generally. And we have these curriculum materials, which are free. And again, if anyone of you are interested in getting these curriculum materials to use in a campaign to get your school district to redress segregation in this way, I'll share the links to them with you. In many, many communities were segregated by the federal government. It required the collaboration of developers like Levitt, of real estate agents, of banks that financed these communities on a segregated basis. Those banks, those realtors, those developers are still in existence today in most cases. A local committee to redress segregation can identify the institutions in their community that have a legacy of creating our segregation. The present operators of those institutions aren't responsible for that, but the institutions when it absorbed the assets and liabilities of their predecessor institutions, absorbed the moral liabilities as well. And the local committee to redress racial segregation should be pressing those institutions to create, for example, down payment assistance funds that would assist people whom they historically excluded from accessing higher quality housing. And again, I can send you a link to an article that describes how that might be done. So there's much we can do to redress segregation. First, we need to learn the history of the unconstitutional system of segregation that we have. And I'm hopeful that as we move forward, that I can engage with many of you in this common enterprise. With that, I'd be glad to engage in a discussion and questions and answers for as long as you have time for. Thank you very much.
Great. Richard, thank you so much. That was great. And I think, let me change my view here to gallery mode. So we are going to open it up for questions. As people, my colleagues here are getting ready to or gather their thoughts. I did want to ask a first one. You did talk about a new civil rights movement in the last year, especially since the George Floyd murder. Things have picked up in that sense, but it seems that we've also become much more polarized, as evidenced by the last few weeks and the things that happened in DC and the rise of white supremacy. What parallels, or what can you talk about the civil rights movement in the 60s and what's happening today, and how maybe what your thoughts are on all this?
Well, I'm very, very hopeful. The demonstrations, as you mentioned, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, engaged some 20 million Americans, blacks and whites, in a call for racial justice. That creates the context for activist groups to take action on police reform, as the demonstrations were focused on community policing, demilitarization of the police, but also on the broader issue of residential segregation, which, as I indicated, underlies a lot of the police abuse of African Americans. So we need to move beyond one-time demonstrations into the creation of real organizations that, on an ongoing basis, will have a continuous program of mobilizing support for concrete actions and policies to redress segregation. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion today in this country about race than we ever have had before in American history. That provides an opportunity for the creation of organization, but it needs to move beyond the discussion, which is very, very positive and hopeful, to an organizational frame.
So Professor David Corsi, I think, had a question. So David, if you would unmute and...
Yep, just did.
Great, thank you.
I can be trained. Thank you so very much. I actually grew up my dad was a steel worker, and I'm gonna give you some context before my question. My dad was a steel worker in Birmingham, Alabama, inner suburbs, as I like to call it. And he was the first homeowner in the area to sell the home to a black family. And oh boy, I remember that very much in the 4th grade, all the issues that created. That neighborhood was exclusively white. You go to it now, half the homes are boarded up. I lived that experience. I have a question about one of your policy proposals, and it's probably details on what the pecuniary effects would be. And this is sort of going to be an economics perspective, sorry. Your idea about discounting houses in predominantly white neighborhoods to encourage desegregation, a number of questions about how that would really work and what its impacts would be. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 and in a row here, sorry. One is, how do you prevent the buyer from simply turning the house around and selling it and posting a huge profit and moving somewhere else? Second, how do you let's see. So one of the ideas, I guess, you could keep the value of the difference between the discounted and the market value in the government's hands with some type of policy. So that can't really be done, but that's a detail. How do you prevent this is number 2, how do you prevent the property values and homes in segregated neighborhoods from deteriorating because of now you've discounted the homes in the other areas? So you could wind up giving a huge financial advantage to a small number of families while greatly disadvantaging families in the original segregated neighborhoods. And third, this is, I think, probably the biggest problem. How do you handle this? How do you handle this policy in a state with high property taxes like Texas? Because you can get the family in there, but if they can't afford the property tax, end of game. So how do you handle property tax abatement or exclusions such that the family can still afford to live there, even though you've discounted the capital value of the home?
Well, David, I invite you to help me develop this idea further.
Okay.
The answers to your questions, but figure out the answers to your questions. But let me give you a couple of thoughts. One is, of course, you can't prevent somebody from selling their home and realizing a big benefit. So what? We don't prevent white families from selling homes that they've appreciated and gaining a big benefit from the appreciation and the value of their homes. And we don't need to do that for Black families as well. Maybe when you develop this proposal further, you will tell me that you think that the federal program should keep on going in order to stabilize a desegregated pattern, and not end with the first 13% of homes in the neighborhood, to use that example, to keep the stabilized ratio. That's perhaps, as I never thought about that before, but perhaps that's one thing that should be done. The flipping of all white suburbs to deteriorated African-American neighborhoods typically happens because of Fair Housing Act violations, and before the Fair Housing Act, on constitutional violations by blockbusters. And that I don't know the neighborhood. Which city was your
Birmingham, and that's exactly what
Birmingham,
happened.
that's right. Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's what caused that suburb to flip, but that was clearly I say it's a constitutional violation, this blockbusting, because every one of the realtors who participated in this scheme to flip, what they do is they panicked. I described this in the book. They panicked white homeowners into thinking that they were going to lose property value if they didn't sell quickly, and the whites sold at much far below market value to these realtors and speculators. They panicked them with tactics like hiring Black women to walk through the neighborhood, pushing baby carriages. They, in my book, I described one of these who bragged about the fact that he organized burglaries in these neighborhoods once the first Black family moved in, to panic whites into the fact that their neighborhood was turning into a dangerous place. And then the realtors flipped them and sold them at above market rates to African Americans. Right. Which indicates that, in fact, the property value myth was a myth, because when African Americans were able to buy homes in previously white neighborhoods, property values rose because African Americans with a short supply of homes available to them were willing to pay more for the same homes, similar homes, than whites were willing to pay. And so if a white homeowner was wanting to move, maybe got a better job somewhere else, maybe had a larger family, for whatever reason, it was to the white homeowner's advantage to sell to an African American rather than to white initially, before the blockbusters came in. And if you went through these neighborhoods that had one or two African American homes in them before the blockbusters got there, you would see that the best maintained homes were the ones that were owned by African Americans. So, and the Federal Housing Administration was perfectly aware of this. They were perfectly aware of the fact that the property value decline story was completely mythical. It occurred only because speculators, engaged in this blockbusting practice. And I say it's unconstitutional because every one of these realtors was licensed by a state licensing agency. And the state licensing agencies were completely aware of the practices. In fact, in one case that I wrote about in the book, some residents protested to the state licensing agency in California about the fact that the president of the California Real Estate Board had set up shop in a neighborhood in what's now Silicon Valley to engage in this kind of blockbusting activity, and the regulatory agency wrote back saying this was none of their concern. So, I'm sorry, go on.
Follow up back to the first point. I really am concerned and disagree with you about the, well, so what if they sell the house and turn it around? Well, let's say that you have a house worth $500,000 and you use this program and the federal government devotes $200,000 in capital. It really bothers me someone can flip that. I think if you're going to do this program, then what you're going to have to do is write it in a way the federal government retains the $200,000 in capital, period. And the homeowner can have complete ownership, because otherwise what you're doing is you're spending a huge amount of money to the benefit of a single family. And assuming you only have so much money to affect this policy, and $200,000 can go a long way elsewhere. And if the idea is to get them in the house, you're doing that with a guarantee like that without giving a huge benefit to one particular family.
Well, as I said, I welcome your correspondence with me to develop this program further, but I do wonder why that bothers you so much, and it doesn't bother you that one of the beneficiaries of the FHA and VA segregation policy can go from working class to upper middle class simply by holding on to a home for a while that was subsidized by the federal government.
But the difference is that's appreciation as opposed to artificially and understandably changing the current value and selling at current value. There's a difference between investment. Now, if a family gets the home and it increases in market value, certainly that should be theirs. But just giving them an opportunity to take the complete market value difference because of the discount doesn't seem like a good use of resources.
Why certainly should that be theirs? When the federal government began this program, the white returning war veterans were looking for housing. They had no understanding. They had no expectation that they were going to get a windfall from the fact that these homes appreciated in value. That wasn't the reason they moved into these homes. They needed housing, and they needed working class housing.
Sure.
So I don't know why they were entitled to this windfall, and but in any event, this is something we can discuss. We have to take up your meeting's time.
But it's a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate your ideas. They're very interesting, and I would appreciate the opportunity to talk more about some of the ideas and how to flesh out the policy proposals.
Good. Well,
property tax, I think, is a huge problem in some states like Texas. Without something associated with that, the capital outlay isn't really going to have much impact.
Okay. Well, ask one of the organizers of this meeting for my email address and get in contact with me, and I'll be glad to discuss this with you further.
Great. Thank you so much.
We will share your contact info with David. And somebody else, if they want to. Diane, thank you.
Hi, my name is Diane Allen. I really thoroughly enjoyed your book, especially because I like the fact that it was data. It was based on data, historical data. You really gave proof of something that we've known, but I really appreciated that. So I wanted to know if you have thought about the other attack on Black communities that was happening then and is still happening. And that is, at the same time when Black communities stayed segregated and thrived, we think of, the community in Tulsa. There were many communities like that. When they thrived, yet they were intentionally attacked, destroyed, and even when, later on, when highways were dropped into thriving Black communities, today, gentrification is that same kind of attack. If you have looked at that, that was a parallel kind of thing that was happening. So if you could talk to that, that would be really great. Thank you.
Well, I distinguish gentrification from the other two examples that you referred to. The other two examples that you referred to were public policies. The annihilation of the neighborhood in Tulsa was supported by local government. certainly, I have a section of my book that, as you know, I describe the use of highway routing to destroy African-American neighborhoods. Gentrification is an entirely different issue. What we know, and I said before, we know the policies to redress segregation, and we know how to prevent massive dislocation of African-American families and Hispanic families from neighborhoods that gentrify. One is rent control that should be imposed, tough rent control, not token rent control, that prevents families from being forced out of their homes because because of the gentrification process, and landlords can raise the rent. Another is limits on condominium conversions. Another is inclusionary zoning that requires a share of new housing that is built by developers in gentrifying neighborhoods to be for both low income and moderate income units. And the last one that I think is very, very important, and it's not the same as what I was just talking about with the last discussion, and that is we need to freeze property taxes for existing homeowners. In not just, it should be done everywhere. I always quote, and I did in the book, and perhaps you remember this, I quote a program that was promoted by the Internal Revenue Service Commissioner in the Obama administration, John Koskinen. And he suggests that we should freeze property taxes as a way of preventing displacement of homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods, but then recoup the lost property taxes at point of sale. As you know, probably, the state of California has a property tax freeze. It's been a disaster because it's starved schools and libraries and fire departments of the funds they need to serve the population adequately. But if you have a homeowner, I'll just make up this example. If you have a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood who bought a home, 20, 30 years ago for $50,000 and lives in it and pays property taxes at the $50,000 rate for as long as she lives in it, and then sells it for $500,000, instead of making a $450,000 capital gain on it, the lost property taxes at that point are returned to the public treasury. And so maybe she only makes a $400,000 or $350,000 profit. That would be a way of freezing property taxes to prevent massive dislocation from gentrification without starving the public treasury of the funds that it depends on from property taxes. Of course, it's a long-term equalization that would require, but that's one way we can do it.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Allen. And Dr. Kay Holliday had her hand up. Sorry, I missed that. I'm a really bad moderator.
No problem. It's okay. Thanks very much for this conversation. And the color of law has really struck a nerve and really created a lot of public conversations that are really powerful. It's just been a really great book for jumpstarting that. And I think I'm a historian, and it's been interesting to see that. And having read the Crabgrass Frontier back in grad school, and doing planning history and writing term papers about deed restrictions in neighborhoods near the schools that I attended, it's always been difficult to discuss that history with the public, especially, or even with professional colleagues who are resistant to it, and who are really resistant to this history of segregation and racism and how intentional it was. And I know you must have had very vast experience at this point in thinking about how to make this history something that people will accept on some level. And I wish you could talk a little bit more about how you crafted the narrative of the book and how you talk to people about that history in ways that really brings them to the table.
Well, let me say that the subtitle of the book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's not hidden. It wasn't hidden. In the mid-20th century, everybody knew what was going on. The public officials knew what was going on. There was a Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in 1969 and 70 who said we need to fix this. He said that the federal government's created a white noose around every urban area, and we need to untie that noose. His name was George Romney. the father of a present public official. So it's a forgotten history, and that's why, and we forgot it, I think, because we don't want to face the necessity of dealing with it. It's easy to forget it, but that's why we are promoting curricular reform in schools. And as I said, I'll make available curriculum materials to you. And there are many, many others that I haven't been involved in. And, that's why you'll forgive me, but that's why I'm killing myself giving lecture after lecture about this. And I think it is becoming better known. There are, I'm going to, as I said before, I'm going to give you the opportunity to sign up to receive information about this new civil rights group. And I've got a list, or I don't, but the group now has a list of 15,000 people who have indicated interest in engaging this kind of activity. And I hope it will grow, and local groups will begin to publicize the need for this kind of action. So all we can do is each one of us try to create the public understanding to redress segregation. And I am sure that you have a few friends you can talk to about this who haven't yet thought about it very much.
Yes. Yes, I do it all the time.
Yeah. I think we are right at 1 hour. So I think that's unless somebody else has one more question, that sounds like a good place to end, for us to reach out to our network and our friends. If y'all would join me in saying thank you, and maybe unmute your mics, and thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for taking the time. We've thoroughly enjoyed this, and it's going to be great for our community here in Dallas-Fort Worth. As you may know, we're the 4th largest metropolitan area in the country with a lot of growth, and so these issues are very important to us and our college. So thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you for being so persistent in getting me to your campus, even if it had to be virtual.
Thank you so much. All right. Thanks, everybody.